In 1939, a mysterious document known as the Oslo Report arrived at a British embassy, revealing the Nazis' most terrifying military secrets. But who was the shadow operative feeding the Allies this impossible intelligence? Discover the clandestine chess match of the physicist who sabotaged heavy water plants and stopped a global nuclear catastrophe before the first bomb could drop. To understand the genesis of this unprecedented betrayal, one must travel back to the gray, damp chill of late autumn in Berlin, 1938. The German capital did not look like the birthplace of a global apocalypse. It was a sprawling, soot-stained metropolis of grand stone facades, clanging streetcars, and citizens wrapped in heavy woolen coats, hurrying past the red and black swastika banners that draped almost every municipal building. Underneath the superficial bustle of a capital preparing for war, a quiet, intellectual earthquake was about to rupture the global scientific community. At the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Chemistry, tucked away in the quiet, tree-lined suburb of Dahlem, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann were hunched over a wooden work table covered in a chaotic tangle of batteries, cables, glass vials, and lead shielding. They were trying to understand an impossible, maddening result. When they bombarded uranium, the heaviest known naturally occurring element, with slow neutrons, they did not create a heavier transuranic element as everyone in the scientific world expected. Instead, their chemical analyses persistently revealed the presence of barium, an element roughly half the mass of uranium. Confused and deeply unsettled by what seemed like a physical impossibility, Hahn wrote an urgent, confidential letter to his former colleague Lise Meitner, a brilliant Jewish physicist who had recently been forced to flee Nazi Germany for her life, seeking her counsel on this bizarre anomaly. Watching these developments from a highly unique, extraordinarily privileged vantage point was a tall, impeccably dressed man with sharp, observant eyes and a calm, disarming demeanor. His name was Paul Rosbaud. As the prestigious scientific editor for Springer Verlag, the world's leading publisher of scientific journals, Rosbaud was the absolute gatekeeper of scientific knowledge in Europe. He was the man who decided what got published, when it got published, and how it was framed. Because of his position, Rosbaud did not just know the elite physicists of the Third Reich. He was their confidant, their sounding board, and their close personal friend. He spent his days drifting through the laboratories, university halls, and smoke-filled dining rooms of Berlin's scientific elite. He listened to their triumphs, their frustrations, and their secrets. To the outside world, and to the increasingly suspicious eyes of the Gestapo, Paul Rosbaud was a loyal, indispensable asset to German academic prestige, a man who kept the gears of German scientific publishing turning smoothly under the watchful eye of the Reich Ministry of Education. But beneath the polished, professional exterior of the respected editor lay a deeply hidden, fiercely burning hatred for the Nazi regime. Rosbaud was a man of profound moral conviction. As he watched the swastika rise over the institutions of learning he loved, he reached a quiet, terrifying decision. He would not merely watch his country slide into barbarism. He would use his unprecedented access to the absolute highest scientific circles of the Third Reich to dismantle the Nazi war machine from the inside, even if it cost him his life. The breakthrough came in December 1938, in her cold exile in Kungälv, Sweden. Lise Meitner, working alongside her nephew Otto Frisch, calculated the physics behind Hahn's baffling experiment. Walking through the snow-covered Swedish woods, they realized that the uranium nucleus had not merely chipped, it had literally split in two. This was nuclear fission. More horrifyingly, Meitner calculated that the splitting of a single uranium atom, according to Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared, released an astonishing amount of energy, roughly 200 million electron volts. When Frisch replicated the experiment in Copenhagen, he confirmed the calculation. The news spread through the global scientific community like wildfire, but no one understood the practical, terrifying implications of this discovery faster than Paul Rosbaud. He knew that if a single split atom could release that much energy, a sustained chain reaction of billions of splitting atoms could release an explosion of unimaginable, apocalyptic power. He immediately rushed Otto Hahn's paper into print in the January 1939 issue of Naturwissenschaften, the prestigious journal he edited. Rosbaud's motivation was twofold. He wanted to ensure that the discovery was made public to the entire world, preventing the Nazi regime from keeping the breakthrough a state secret. And he wanted to establish a baseline of scientific reality that the global community could monitor. By publishing the paper openly, Rosbaud threw a beacon of light onto a discovery that many in the German military were already beginning to look at with dark, predatory interest. As 1939 progressed, the atmosphere in Berlin grew increasingly suffocating. The drums of war were beating louder, and the German military quickly recognized the devastating potential of nuclear energy. The War Office established the Uranverein, or Uranium Club, a highly classified research program dedicated to exploring the military applications of nuclear fission. Some of the greatest minds of the century, including the brilliant theoretical physicist Werner Heisenberg, were recruited into the program. Heisenberg, the pioneer of quantum mechanics and a Nobel laureate, was a man of immense intellectual arrogance and deep nationalistic pride. While not a card-carrying Nazi, Heisenberg was fiercely loyal to the concept of Germany as a dominant cultural and scientific superpower, and he had no qualms about leading a project that could hand Adolf Hitler the ultimate weapon. Paul Rosbaud watched this consolidation of scientific talent with growing dread. He knew these men. He knew how brilliant they were, how resourceful they could be, and how close they were to unlocking the secrets of the atomic bomb. He realized that if the Nazis succeeded in building a nuclear weapon before the Allies, the darkness of the Third Reich would descend upon the globe, perhaps permanently. The stakes were absolute. There was no middle ground, no room for passive resistance. Rosbaud knew he had to act, and he had to do so with a level of precision and secrecy that would keep him one step ahead of the most ruthless counterintelligence apparatus in human history. It was during this tense, pre-war summer of 1939 that Paul Rosbaud fully stepped into the shadows, adopting the secret identity that would define his wartime existence. The asset, codenamed Gryphon. Rosbaud was not a professional spy. He had no training in tradecraft, no knowledge of dead drops, cipher keys, or evasive maneuvers, but he possessed something far more valuable: an analytical mind, an encyclopedic knowledge of physics, and an innate ability to read people. He understood that the German scientific community was not a monolith. It was a fractured, highly competitive ecosystem, driven by professional rivalries, resource scarcity, and varying degrees of ideological commitment to the Nazi Party. Rosbaud utilized his role as an editor to act as a neutral intermediary, traveling between laboratories, attending private dinners, and listening to the casual, unguarded complaints of frustrated researchers. He became a master of the polite, probing question, gently nudging scientists to reveal the precise nature of their bottlenecks, their breakthroughs, and their administrative struggles. To his colleagues, he was simply Paul, the sympathetic editor who understood their work and shared their professional anxieties. To the British Secret Intelligence Service, better known as MI6, he was a goldmine of impossible, high-value intelligence, a lone operative operating at the very heart of the Reich's most sensitive scientific endeavors. As the summer of 1939 bled into autumn, the German army prepared to invade Poland, and the world held its breath. Rosbaud knew that once hostilities commenced, the borders would close, communications would be severed, and the flow of information would become infinitely more difficult. He needed to establish a channel, a definitive proof of his capability, and a comprehensive warning to the West of what the German war machine was preparing to unleash. This culminated in one of the most remarkable and high-risk intelligence operations of the early war period, the creation and delivery of what would become known as the Oslo Report. Working in tandem with a sympathetic German physicist and source named Hans Ferdinand Mayer, Rosbaud helped compile a massive, detailed dossier of Germany's experimental weapon programs. The document was a breathtaking roadmap of secret Nazi technology. It detailed the development of rocket-propelled glider bombs, piloted torpedoes, advanced radar systems, proximity fuses, and, most crucially, early plans for long-range rockets at a secret facility on the Baltic coast called Peenemünde. It also contained a chillingly accurate assessment of Germany's interest in uranium research. The delivery of this information was a masterpiece of cold, calculated risk-taking. In November 1939, a package was quietly left at the British legation in Oslo, Norway. It was addressed to the British naval attaché, Captain Hector Boyes. Inside was a typed, unsigned document written in clean, concise German, accompanied by a small, sealed glass tube containing a prototype of a highly advanced proximity fuse. The British intelligence establishment was instantly thrown into a state of deep, paranoid confusion. To many traditional military intelligence officers, the document seemed too good to be true. It was a classic dangle, an elaborate, incredibly sophisticated piece of disinformation designed by the Abwehr, German military intelligence, to lead the British down endless, wasteful rabbit holes or to panic them into making strategic blunders. How could a single source possess detailed technical blueprints and strategic roadmaps for so many highly classified, completely separate military programs? The compartmentalization of the Nazi state should have made such a synthesis impossible. However, there was one man in London who did not dismiss the report out of hand. Dr. Reginald Victor Jones, a brilliant young physicist who had been appointed as the scientific advisor to the British Air Ministry. Jones, who would go on to become the father of scientific intelligence, analyzed the Oslo Report with a scientist's eye. While others saw a suspicious excess of detail, Jones saw a pattern of technical accuracy that was too precise to be a fabrication. He realized that the author of the report was not a military officer, but a scientist, someone who understood the underlying physics of these weapons and who had access to the intellectual networks of the German state. Jones quietly kept the report close, using its technical predictions as a template to monitor German developments. Over the next 2 years, as British radar stations began detecting the exact frequencies warned of in the report, and as the first whispers of a rocket test site at Peenemünde began to filter through aerial reconnaissance, Jones's faith in the anonymous Oslo author was spectacularly vindicated. The Oslo Report was not a trap. It was a miraculous, accurate blueprint of the enemy's future arsenal. And it had been hand-delivered to the British doorstep by the Gryphon and his allies. With the outbreak of war, Rosbaud's life became a daily, grueling exercise in psychological survival. Every morning, he walked through a Berlin that was rapidly transforming under the weight of wartime mobilization. Rations were introduced, coal was scarce, and the streets were filled with wounded soldiers and the ubiquitous, black-coated officers of the SS. Rosbaud had to maintain a flawless facade of professional dedication. He continued to edit Naturwissenschaften, ensuring that the journal maintained its high standards, which ironically served as a vital source of foreign currency and scientific prestige for the Reich. This professional success was his ultimate shield. It allowed him to justify his continued interactions with the elite of the Uranverein, including Heisenberg, Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, and Walther Gerlach, the administrative head of the nuclear project. Rosbaud's office at Springer Verlag became a sanctuary for scientists who were politically suspect, many of whom he quietly helped to protect or assist in escaping the country before the borders slammed shut entirely. But Rosbaud's true, silent work was occurring in the margins of his professional life. He utilized his permitted academic travel to occupied territories, particularly Norway and Denmark, to maintain contact with Allied intelligence networks. Traveling during the war was an incredibly dangerous endeavor, requiring multiple exit visas, travel permits, and face-to-face interviews with Gestapo officials who scrutinized every passenger for signs of defeatism or espionage. Rosbaud, with his calm demeanor, aristocratic manners, and impeccable academic credentials, navigated these checkpoints with an almost supernatural composure. He carried highly technical blueprints, troop movements, and research summaries in his head, or occasionally written in tiny, microscopic script hidden inside the bindings of scientific journals or hollowed-out fountain pens. He knew that a single slip, a single suspicious glance from a border guard, or a routine search that uncovered a misplaced piece of paper would result in immediate arrest, brutal interrogation in the basement of Prince Albrechtstrasse, and a swift execution by guillotine or firing squad. During his travels, Rosbaud began to isolate the critical strategic bottleneck in the German nuclear program, heavy water or deuterium oxide, D2O. Unlike the American Manhattan Project, which would eventually pursue both uranium enrichment and graphite-moderated reactors to produce plutonium, the German Uranverein had made a critical, fundamental error early in their research. The brilliant but arrogant physicist Walther Bothe had conducted experiments to measure the neutron absorption of graphite, concluding that graphite was unsuitable as a moderator for a nuclear reactor because it absorbed too many neutrons. In reality, Bothe's graphite was contaminated with trace amounts of boron, a powerful neutron absorber. Had he purified the graphite, the Germans would have realized it was an excellent, cheap, and abundant moderator. Instead, Heisenberg and the other top German theoreticians accepted Bothe's results without double-checking them. They ruled out graphite and concluded that the only viable moderator to slow down neutrons and sustain a nuclear chain reaction was heavy water. This was a massive, catastrophic strategic blunder, and Paul Rosbaud recognized it instantly. Heavy water is extremely difficult and energy-intensive to produce. In 1940, there was only one facility in the entire world capable of producing heavy water in industrial quantities: the Vemork hydroelectric plant, operated by Norsk Hydro, built on a sheer cliffside near the town of Rjukan in the rugged, snow-choked wilderness of occupied Norway. The German military immediately seized control of the Vemork plant, ordering the Norwegian engineers to drastically scale up production of the precious blue-tinted liquid. The battle lines of the atomic race had suddenly crystallized around a single, highly vulnerable target in the Norwegian mountains. Rosbaud knew that if the Allies could destroy or disrupt the production of heavy water at Vemork, they would effectively paralyze the entire German nuclear program, regardless of how many brilliant physicists Heisenberg had at his disposal. Rosbaud began systematically gathering every scrap of information he could find regarding the German demands on Vemork. He listened to the complaints of German physicists who were furious about delays in heavy water shipments. He noted the precise quantities of heavy water Heisenberg's laboratory in Leipzig was requesting, and he used his contacts within the occupied Norwegian scientific community to monitor the security measures, structural layouts, and production schedules at the plant itself. He smuggled this highly specific, incredibly dense technical data out of Germany, routing it through underground resistance networks in Norway and Sweden directly to London. When the intelligence landed on the desk of Dr. R.V. Jones and the British Special Operations Executive, SOE, it was treated with the highest level of urgency. The Allies realized they had to strike Vemork, but the physical location of the plant made a conventional military assault almost suicidal. The facility was perched on a massive, steep rock shelf, surrounded by sheer mountain walls, accessible only by a single, heavily guarded suspension bridge spanning a deep, yawning chasm. The air defenses were formidable, and the surrounding terrain was a frozen, trackless wasteland subject to sudden, violent blizzards. This set the stage for a series of some of the most daring, high-stakes commando raids in the history of special warfare. The first attempt, Operation Freshman, in November 1942, was a disaster. Two gliders carrying British sappers crashed in the harsh Norwegian mountains. The survivors were captured by the Gestapo, brutally interrogated, and executed under Hitler's infamous commando order. The tragedy weighed heavily on the Allied command, but the stakes were too high to abandon the mission. Rosbaud's intelligence continued to flow, detailing the increased German security measures and the desperate need to strike before the Germans could accumulate enough heavy water to construct a working, self-sustaining reactor. In February 1943, the Allies launched Operation Gunnerside. A small team of 6 Norwegian commandos, trained by the SOE, parachuted into the frozen Hardangervidda Plateau. They survived for days in the brutal winter cold, eating wild reindeer, before descending the sheer cliffs of the gorge, wading through a freezing, ice-choked river, and climbing up the opposite cliff face to bypass the heavily guarded suspension bridge, utilizing highly detailed structural maps of the plant, maps that had been verified and detailed. Through the intelligence networks Rosbaud supported, the commandos slipped inside the heavy water electrolysis room through a cable shaft. They quietly planted plastic explosives around the vital concentration cells, lit the fuses, and slipped back into the night. The resulting explosion shattered the concentration cells, destroying over 500 kilograms of heavy water and completely shutting down production for months. It was a stunning, clean, tactical triumph, executed without a single loss of Allied life. When the news of the sabotage reached Berlin, Paul Rosbaud had to perform the most difficult acting job of his life. He sat in meetings with furious military officials and devastated physicists, nodding sympathetically, expressing his deep professional regret over the cowardly Allied attack. While inside, he was singing with a quiet, triumphant joy. He knew that every drop of heavy water spilled onto the concrete floor of Vemork was a drop that would never find its way into Werner Heisenberg's experimental pile. But the Germans were resilient, and they immediately began rebuilding the facility. Within months, Vemork was back in operation, and the precious shipments of heavy water were scheduled to resume. Recognizing the limitations of commando raids against a now highly alert garrison, the U.S. Army Air Forces launched a massive daylight bombing raid on Vemork in November 1943, sending over 100 B-17 flying fortresses to plaster the mountain stronghold. While the heavy stone structure of the electrolysis plant survived the direct hits, the surrounding power station and infrastructure were severely damaged. convincing the German command that producing heavy water in occupied Norway was no longer viable. They reached a desperate decision. They would dismantle the entire heavy water production facility, pack up the remaining stocks of semi-processed liquid, and transport it under heavy guard back to the relative safety of the German homeland. This led to the final, dramatic act of the heavy water war, the sinking of the Norwegian ferry SF Hydro on Lake Tinnsjø in February 1944. The ferry was carrying the final railway cars, loaded with the precious cargo of heavy water, acting on urgent intelligence that traced the exact route and timing of the shipment. Intelligence that Rosbaud's network helped secure and validate. Norwegian resistance fighters slipped aboard the ferry overnight and planted a time bomb in the bow. The ship sank into the deep, dark waters of the lake, taking the last of Germany's industrial heavy water reserves to the bottom. The bottleneck had been permanently closed. The German nuclear program was now running on a finite, rapidly dwindling supply of moderator, effectively crippling their ability to achieve a self-sustaining chain reaction before the war's end. While the battle for heavy water raged in the mountains of Norway, Paul Rosbaud was fighting an equally critical, far more subtle war of attrition in the academic salons and offices of Berlin. He realized that physical sabotage was only half the battle. He also had to wage a psychological war of disinformation and subtle, intellectual disruption. The German scientific community was deeply hierarchical, and many of the top scientists were highly sensitive to criticism, professional rivalry, and the constant threat of being sent to the Eastern Front if their work was deemed non-essential to the immediate war effort. Rosbaud masterfully exploited these vulnerabilities. He became a silent whisperer in the ears of the Uranverein scientists. When talking to Heisenberg, he would gently, subtly reinforce Heisenberg's own theoretical assumptions, even when Rosbaud knew those assumptions were flawed or led down dead-end research paths. He played on the scientists' professional vanity, agreeing with their assessments that the physics of a nuclear weapon were so immensely complex that no nation, especially not the industrially strained United States, could possibly build a bomb during the course of the war. This reinforced a dangerous, complacent consensus within the German scientific elite. They believed they were far ahead of the Allies, and because they believed they were ahead, they saw no need to rush, to take wild experimental risks, or to question their fundamental theoretical models. Rosbaud actively worked to protect key scientists who were quiet opponents of the regime, or who wished to drag their feet on military research. He knew that if a scientist was suspected of sabotage or defeatism, they would be replaced by a fanatical, ideologically driven Nazi party member who might actually bring the necessary urgency and administrative efficiency to the project. Rosbaud used his position to write glowing professional reviews, to justify the retention of moderate scientists on essential research projects, and to help them navigate the complex, terrifying bureaucracy of the Reich Ministry of Armaments. By keeping the foot-draggers and the theoretically cautious academics in charge of the key research clusters, Rosbaud ensured that the German project remained fractured, slow-moving, and bogged down in academic turf wars. This stood in stark, dramatic contrast to the Allied effort. Across the Atlantic, the Manhattan Project was operating with a level of industrial scale, administrative urgency, and scientific collaboration that the world had never seen before. Led by the brilliant, driving administrative genius of General Leslie Groves and the scientific leadership of J. Robert Oppenheimer, the Americans and British were pouring billions of dollars and tens of thousands of personnel into a massive, highly synchronized industrial network. They were pursuing multiple, redundant technological paths simultaneously: electromagnetic separation, gaseous diffusion, and plutonium production reactors. In Germany, the entire nuclear budget was a microscopic fraction of the Manhattan Project's resources. The German scientists operated in small, isolated pockets: Heisenberg's group in Berlin and Leipzig, Kurt Diebner's rival group in Gotha, and other scattered laboratories in Hamburg and Munich. They kept secrets from one another, competed fiercely for the tiny allocations of uranium and heavy water, and lived in constant fear of Allied air raids that forced them to repeatedly pack up their laboratories and flee into the countryside. As the war entered its final, apocalyptic phase in 1944 and 1945, the pressure on Paul Rosbaud became almost unbearable. The Allied bombing campaigns had reduced Berlin to a smoking, cratered wasteland of charred ruins, twisted steel, and hollowed-out stone facades. The air raid sirens wailed almost every night, sending Rosbaud and his fellow citizens crowding into dark, damp basement shelters where the earth shook continuously under the impact of high-explosive blockbusters. The Gestapo, increasingly desperate, paranoid, and ruthless as the military situation disintegrated, began a systematic campaign of terror within the German state. Following the failed July 20th plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler, the regime turned its predatory gaze onto the academic and scientific elite, searching for any sign of defeatism, treason, or foreign contact. Rosbaud lived in a state of constant, hyper-vigilant terror. He knew that many of his close friends and associates had been swept up in the purges. He had to watch his words with absolute precision, knowing that a single casual remark, a tired sigh, or a failure to display sufficient enthusiasm for the final victory could lead to a denunciation by a fanatical neighbor or a suspicious colleague. He had no radio transmitter, no armed bodyguards, and no escape route. He was a lone man in a dark, crumbling city, armed only with his intellect and his courage. Yet, even as the world collapsed around him, he continued to gather intelligence. He monitored the final desperate attempts of the Uranverein to build a working reactor in a cave underneath the picturesque castle town of Haigerloch in southwestern Germany. He knew the precise location of the remaining uranium piles, the state of Heisenberg's experimental designs, and the growing despair of the German scientific community. He smuggled this vital, final intelligence out of the country through an incredibly high-risk escape route that ran through the occupied Netherlands. His Dutch contacts, operating under the constant threat of execution, risked their lives to relay the Gryphon's reports to London. These final reports were of immense, historic importance. They confirmed to the Allies that, despite their fears, the Germans were nowhere near achieving a self-sustaining nuclear reaction, let alone constructing a deliverable atomic bomb. This intelligence allowed Allied commanders to make critical strategic decisions, knowing they did not have to fear a surprise Nazi nuclear strike as they advanced into the heart of the Reich. In the spring of 1945, the Red Army breached the outer defenses of Berlin, and the battle for the capital began in earnest. The city was transformed into a hellscape of street-to-street fighting, artillery barrages, and smoke that blocked out the sun. Paul Rosbaud, hunkered down in the ruins of Springer Verlag, survived on meager rations of dirty water and stale bread, waiting for the end. When the Soviet troops finally secured his sector of the city, they found a tired, emaciated man who possessed a quiet, dignified composure that set him apart from the surrounding ruins.